Imagine a classic ancient Roman for a second. What picture comes to mind? Most likely, a muscular, fair-skinned guy with a straight nose, dark hair, wearing a toga, with a face that looks like it was chiseled out of marble in some museum hall. Well, throw that picture away, it's entirely made up. Scientists extracted DNA from bones dug up around Rome, ran it through analysis, and compared it with the genetic passport of every nationality on the planet. And the result literally turned antiquity inside out. It turns out that the person we habitually call a Roman genetically stands not next to a guy from Tuscany, but somewhere close to a Syrian, a Lebanese, or a Turk. Do you feel the scale? The empire that ruled half the known world wasn't built by the people that school textbooks have been depicting for 1,000 years. And believe me, this is just the appetizer. It all began with ordinary scientific work without flashy headlines. The study itself was published in the journal Science, prepared by a team from Stanford together with Italian scientists. They worked with 127 skeletons recovered from 29 archaeological sites around Rome. The oldest bones date back about 12,000 years. The most recent ones belong to the Middle Ages. Essentially, the researchers obtained a genetic movie. They could scroll through the tape of millennia and watch how the faces of the eternal city changed. And here's what they found. In Rome's early days, still during the early Republic, the genetics of the city's inhabitants looked fairly homogeneous. They clustered close to the peoples of the Bronze Age, the Etruscans, the Latins, in short, the very set we habitually expect to see on Italian soil. Dark-eyed, average height, with the genes of those Balkan and Anatolian farmers who had arrived here thousands of years earlier. No exotic elements. Italy in its pure form. Then came what geneticists today describe with one short word: an explosion. Sometime between the 3rd century BCE and the 2nd century CE, right at the peak of the empire, the capital's gene pool flipped upside down. Not smoothly, not gradually, but in leaps and bounds. The DNA of local inhabitants becomes almost a copy of the DNA of modern Greeks, Cypriots, Lebanese, Syrians. The Eastern Mediterranean essentially picked up and moved to Rome entirely. Every second person whose bones lay in Italian soil for 2,000 years turned out by their genome to be closer to Beirut than to Milan. And that's not a fancy figure of speech. These are dry numbers. Where did it all come from? It's all transparent. Rome conquered Greece, Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, and from there came a wave of slaves, merchants, legionaries, craftsmen, teachers, cooks, doctors, and sex workers. By various estimates, the capital itself held between 1 and 1.5 million people, and the lion's share of them were not descendants of Romulus and Remus at all, but immigrants from the eastern provinces. Greek was spoken not only among philosophers, it was heard on the streets. In the markets, Aramaic, Coptic, and Thracian filled the air. Rome, in fact, didn't just speak Latin. Rome hummed in dozens of different languages at once. But even that is not the most astonishing part. Next, the scientists looked at what happened to the genetics after the fall of the Western Empire. And here, a 180-degree turn. In the early Middle Ages, after the Goths, Lombards, and other Germanic tribes swept across the peninsula, Italy's genetics shifted again, only this time towards the north. In the bones of people who lived in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, Celtic, Germanic, and Northern European ancestry clearly shows up. The Italian has moved noticeably closer to the French and Germans. The Eastern trace didn't disappear, but it blurred, dissolved, receded into the background. And that's how today's Italian was formed, a genetic cocktail with a bit of everything: the Anatolian farmer, the Syrian slave, the Gothic warrior, and the Norman knight. And here is the main, most sobering conclusion of this work. There are no pure nations in nature. There never were. A people is not a sealed box where everyone inside shares identical DNA. A people is a river into which new tributaries constantly flow. And if a Roman from the age of Augustus came face to face with a modern Italian, they would most likely not recognize each other as even distant relatives, neither by speech, nor appearance, nor genes. But let's go even deeper, because this story has another face hidden. When scientists compared Roman DNA with all the peoples of the world, and they did it quickly, databases allow such work in a few hours, completely unexpected things emerged. For instance, Romans of the imperial era turned out genetically closer to modern Greeks from Crete than to Sicilians, even though Sicily is formally an Italian island and Crete is Greece. And even more striking, in some samples they found a clear trace pointing to North Africa. So Rome was home to descendants of Berbers, Libyans, and Carthaginians. Not just a couple of itinerant merchants, but entire families with children. Their bones lie in the same necropolises next to Celts, Jews, Armenians, and Thracians. This was a metropolis in the most modern sense of the word, a giant melting pot. From this arises a question to which genetics responds without any pity. Who exactly is this true Roman? Julius Caesar, yes, he really came from the ancient Latin aristocracy. But Emperor Septimius Severus, for example, was born in Leptis Magna, in what is now Libya. At home he spoke Punic. He picked up Latin later. Emperor Philip the Arab, originally from modern Emperor Elagabalus from Emesa, again Syria. And Caracalla in 212 CE simply granted citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, meaning that legally, millions of people became Romans overnight from Britain to Mesopotamia. And genetics merely confirmed what coins, inscriptions, and names had long hinted at. A Roman is not blood, it's not ethnicity, it's a status, a sense of self, basically a passport. And here the plot twists even tighter. Because the researchers didn't stop at genealogy alone, they tried to overlay this data onto the daily life of the ancient city. What people ate, what diseases they had, how they died. And here another fascinating detail emerged. Many Romans with Eastern roots had genes providing resistance to malaria, which makes perfect sense. They brought the disease with them from their homeland and also carried a shield against it. Others had variants responsible for poor alcohol tolerance, typically found in peoples of the Caucasus. Still others had genetic traces typical of Bronze Age Arab tribes. The city didn't just absorb people. The city itself turned into a giant medical laboratory. Diseases mixed, immunities exchanged, and after a couple of generations, a new population emerged, resilient to what had killed their ancestors, but defenseless against things their ancestors had been used to. And here comes the sharpest turn. When the same study compared Romans not only with contemporaries, but with other ancient samples across Europe and Asia, an unexpected match appeared. The DNA of imperial-era Romans almost perfectly matches the DNA of people living at the same time in Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant. That is, the empire standardized not only law and language, it standardized the genome. A person born in Antioch, a person born in Carthage, and a person born in Rome itself in the 3rd century CE were genetically almost identical. The empire did indeed produce a Roman, not an ethnically pure one, but an imperially mixed one. One big people, spread across 3 million square kilometers. And here it's worth pausing. Because in our heads, antiquity is a world of sturdy guys in tunics minting classical Latin. But in reality, it was a multilingual, multicolored, multifaceted world. Accents from all over the Mediterranean buzzed on the streets of Rome. Faces differed, gods differed, cuisines differed. And what held this whole motley mass together was not origin, but a sense of belonging to one big project. The idea of Rome. And when the idea dimmed, disappeared, gave way to others, the gene pool again broke loose, melted down, flowed in a new direction. And what's especially striking is the speed at which all this happened. 200 to 300 years, and the population of an entire metropolis renews itself almost completely. That's less time than separates us from Columbus. By historical standards, a snap of the fingers. And from this emerges a deeply uncomfortable question. What is happening right now to the genetics of peoples? In an era when people jump across continents on airplanes, move across oceans, start families in different hemispheres. In 1,000 years, if some geneticist picks up the bones of a modern Londoner, a Muscovite, a New Yorker, or a Berliner, what will they find there? I'm afraid exactly the same picture they saw in Rome. No purity. A layered cocktail. Not one culture, but imprints of dozens. And this perhaps is the main takeaway from Roman DNA. Not that the Romans turned out different from how imagination painted them, but that any people, any nation, any indigenous population is always a temporary snapshot. One frame in a movie that has been playing for millions of years. Today you are Italian, tomorrow a descendant of Assyrian, the day after a grandson of a Germanic knight, a century later the great-grandchild of a Vietnamese student and a Scottish engineer. Genes cannot lie. Genes simply record movement. But if you think the Roman story ends here, that's an illusion. This study has a dark, almost grim side that is spoken of much more quietly. Among the remains that passed through the scientists' hands, there were mass burials, without headstones, without names, without ornaments. These were slaves. The very hundreds of thousands of souls the empire imported into its cities and ground down. Their DNA, too, lay on the analysis table, and it showed that these people came to Rome from literally everywhere. One skeleton in a common pit, originally from the Black Sea. A neighbor from Ethiopia. Another from the northwestern edge of Gaul. They had nothing in common except one thing. They were all brought to Rome against their will. And all of them left their genes in today's Italians. Every time a resident of 21st century Rome looks into their own reflection, the face of a forgotten slave whom no one bothered to remember 2,000 years ago may appear in their features. And here's what matters. This is no longer just a story about genetics. This is a story about memory, about how bones speak what paper could not hold, about names that no one recorded, about fates that dissolved into marble. And today, thanks to new methods, we are finally hearing this whisper. Not every name, not every biography, but the common murmur. Millions of lives that passed through the gates of the eternal city left a piece of themselves there and went into the ground. You know, when I read this study, one detail caught my attention. One of the buried women was found to have mitochondrial DNA that today is found only in Armenia and a few mountain villages in Georgia. She died in Rome around the 2nd century CE. Most likely, she ended up there as a slave or a soldier's wife, lived her life there, had children, and her descendants spread across Italy. Some modern Italian is a carrier of that same line, a direct relative along the female line through more than 60 generations. And this is not an abstract concept. This is a specific woman with a specific face, whose name we will never know, but whose blood has reached our days. And in this, perhaps, lies the final lesson of Rome. The empire perished. The columns fell. The forum overgrew with weeds. Latin became a dead language. But the people remained. They blurred, mixed, scattered across the world, but did not disappear. Genes are the most stubborn form of memory. Paper burns, marble crumbles to dust, but DNA continues to live, to hide, to be passed on, to surface in unexpected faces across dozens of centuries. And when a modern person gazes at the statue of Augustus in the Vatican Museum, it's not impossible that they are looking not at some stranger's ancestor from a textbook, but at one of their own. And this fact, if truly pondered, is more important than all empires and all borders in the world. We are all one long, endless, uneven continuation of each other. No pure lines, no separate peoples. Only mixtures, migrations, loves, violences, journeys, markets, ships, and again mixtures. That, in essence, is what the DNA of the ancient Romans told us. Not that they turned out to be different, but that all those boundaries and divisions we so stubbornly believe in are self-deception. Comfortable, familiar, cozy, but still self-deception. And every new fragment of ancient bone that falls under the microscope shatters that self-deception into dust. If this story hooked you, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments whose genes, in your opinion, are hidden in your own family. A grandmother who came from somewhere down south.
A great-grandfather with a last name nobody can explain. Family legends about distant lands. Share. I'm genuinely curious to gather these stories.
And remember, you yourself are a little Rome, a crossroads, a melting pot, and half the world hums in your veins even if you don't suspect it yet.